At the height of America's industrial power, when factories ran day and night and cities grew faster than they could be mapped, there were men whose wealth felt limitless. They did not just own companies. They owned eras. In Detroit, Michigan, one such man built a house that was meant to last forever. It no longer exists. This story begins with Packard Mansion. The mansion was built during a time when Detroit was not yet a warning, but a promise. The city was young, aggressive, and expanding outward in every direction. Automobiles were reshaping the country, and those who controlled that industry controlled the future. The Packard Motor Car Company stood at the center of that future. Packard was not mass market. It was not built for everyone. It was precision engineering, luxury, and reputation. A Packard was not purchased casually. It was chosen to signal permanence, discipline, and success. The man behind it believed the same qualities should define his home. The mansion rose in one of Detroit's most prestigious neighborhoods, surrounded by other houses built for power and longevity. Stone walls. High ceilings. Formal rooms designed not for comfort, but for authority. The structure was meant to communicate something before a word was ever spoken. This was not a place to relax. It was a place to rule. Inside, the house reflected the logic of early industrial wealth. Separation, hierarchy, control. Public rooms were vast and ceremonial. Private spaces were hidden away. Servants moved through corridors never meant to be seen. Everything had its place, and nothing overlapped. The mansion was built as a fixed point, an anchor in a city that was expanding too quickly to feel stable. At the time, there was no reason to believe that anchor would ever be tested. Detroit was booming. The automobile industry employed hundreds of thousands. Money flowed into the city faster than it could be spent. New neighborhoods rose almost overnight. Churches, theaters, schools, and mansions followed. The Packard estate was part of that rhythm. It stood not as an exception, but as a confirmation. America was working. Industry was winning. The future felt secure. But beneath that confidence was a fragile assumption that growth was permanent. The mansion was designed for continuity. For generations. For a lineage that would inherit not just wealth, but relevance. It assumed the city around it would remain necessary, valuable, and central to American life. No one planned for absence. As the years passed, the mansion remained immaculate, but the city began to change in ways that were easy to ignore at first. Competition increased. Labor tensions grew. Suburbs pulled wealth outward. The industrial core hardened, then strained. The house did not react. It stood still as the city shifted around it. And that stillness would become a problem. Because houses built for power depend on the systems that create that power. When those systems weaken, the house does not adapt. It waits. And waiting, in a city like Detroit, would prove fatal. The Packard Motor Mansion was built to embody an idea that American industry had reached a point where decline was no longer possible. That idea would not survive the century. And neither would the house. As the mansion settled into its role, Detroit accelerated. The city did not grow carefully. It expanded aggressively, pulled forward by factories, contracts, and an endless demand for labor. Neighborhoods filled faster than they could develop identities. Streets stretched outward. Industry dictated geography. For a time, this chaos felt like progress. The Packard Motor Mansion remained untouched by it. Its walls insulated it from noise, from movement, from uncertainty. Inside, time felt slower. Controlled. Predictable. The house existed in contrast to the city rather than as part of it. That contrast was intentional. Industrial wealth in America was built on separation. The factory floor belonged to labor. The mansion belonged to command. The distance between them was not accidental, it was structural. For years, the system worked. Packard automobiles gained a reputation for reliability and restraint. They were not flashy. They were engineered. They appealed to institutions, to executives, to those who valued control over speed. The mansion reflected the same philosophy. It was not experimental. It was conservative, ordered, and confident. But markets do not reward confidence forever. As the automobile industry matured, competition intensified. New companies emerged with different priorities: mass production, affordability, speed. Detroit's rhythm changed. The city became louder, faster, more volatile. The Packard brand began to feel old-fashioned. That shift did not happen overnight. It arrived gradually, disguised as minor adjustments. Slight declines in market share. Marginal cost pressures. Increasing reliance on past reputation rather than innovation. Inside the mansion, none of this was visible. The house continued to function as if the era that created it were still intact. Dinners were hosted. Meetings were held. The architecture assumed permanence even as the systems that supported it began to thin. Detroit itself began to fragment. Wealth moved outward, away from the industrial core. New suburbs promised space, privacy, and distance from factories. Those who could afford to leave did. Those who remained felt the pressure increase. The mansion did not move. It could not. Its value was tied to location, and location was losing relevance. What had once been a center was becoming an edge. The city's energy shifted elsewhere, and the house was left standing in the path of change rather than ahead of it. Slowly, the mansion became oversized for its purpose. Rooms went unused. Staff numbers shrank. Maintenance became more difficult to justify. The cost of keeping the house perfect began to outweigh its symbolic value. This was the first crack. Not visible. Not dramatic. But decisive. Because once a house built for power begins to feel excessive, it loses its meaning. Excess is only acceptable when growth is unquestioned. When growth falters, excess becomes evidence. Detroit entered the mid-century carrying that tension everywhere. The city was still productive, still populated, still loud, but it was no longer unified. The systems that had once aligned industry, labor, and wealth were pulling apart. The Packard Motor Mansion stood between eras, belonging fully to neither. It was too rigid to adapt. Too large to repurpose easily. Too symbolic to ignore. And like many structures built for authority, it would discover that authority does not decay gracefully. It waits. Until the moment it is no longer needed. Decline rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as adjustment. A smaller staff. Fewer guests. Rooms that remain dark longer than they should. Maintenance postponed not because it is impossible, but because it no longer feels necessary. The Packard Motor Mansion entered this phase without ceremony. The people who once filled it began to leave. Some moved to newer neighborhoods. Others followed the industry outward, away from the city's aging core. Detroit was still functioning, but its center of gravity had shifted, and the mansion was no longer positioned where power naturally gathered. What had once been an asset became a burden. The house demanded resources at a time when efficiency was becoming a survival skill. Heating costs rose. Repairs multiplied. The symbolic weight of the mansion, once a source of pride, began to feel out of place in a city that was learning how to tighten itself. Eventually, the mansion was no longer lived in the way it had been intended. It became transitional. Spaces were repurposed temporarily, then abandoned. Furnishings were removed, not all at once, but in stages. Objects left behind grew sparse. The house lost its rhythm. Without people, large rooms echo differently. Silence settles unevenly. Certain areas begin to feel unused not just physically, but conceptually. The mansion stopped being a home before anyone admitted it had been abandoned. That admission came later. By the time Detroit's industrial decline became impossible to ignore, the Packard Motor Mansion had already fallen out of alignment with the city around it. Factories closed or reduced operations. Jobs disappeared. Neighborhoods thinned. Services followed demand elsewhere. The house remained fixed and unmoving. It did not age well. Buildings designed for authority assume upkeep. When that upkeep slows, deterioration accelerates. Water enters where it should not. Stone fractures. Wood warps. What was once hidden behind constant care becomes visible. The mansion began to show signs of neglect that could not be explained away as temporary windows broke and were not replaced. Roof sections failed and were patched poorly or not at all. The grounds lost definition. Paths blurred into grass. Fences rusted. The structure still stood, but its confidence was gone. At some point, the house crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer waiting for relevance to return. It was waiting for a decision. But Detroit, overwhelmed by larger problems, did not prioritize decisions about empty mansions. The city was managing scale. Infrastructure. Population loss. Economic contraction. A single abandoned house, even one that had once symbolized industrial dominance, was insignificant in comparison. The Packard Mansion became officially unused. And then it became vulnerable. Vacant structures attract attention of a different kind. Not admiration. Not respect. Curiosity mixed with opportunity. Doors are tested. Windows are forced. The first intrusions are tentative, then confident. The mansion was not prepared for this phase. Its scale worked against it. Too many entrances. Too many blind spots. Too much interior space to monitor or secure. Once it was breached, it could not be easily reclaimed. The interior changed quickly. Fixtures were stripped. Decorative elements removed. Anything portable disappeared. What could not be carried away was damaged. Walls were tagged. Floors collapsed under unmonitored weight. Fire scars appeared in rooms that once hosted formal gatherings. The house that had been built to represent control lost it completely. And with that loss came a new identity. The mansion was no longer an artifact of industry. It was no longer a relic of wealth. It became a marker of abandonment. In a city increasingly defined by empty structures, the Packard Mansion was no longer exceptional. It joined a growing population of buildings that told the same story in different forms. Growth had ended. When a building is abandoned long enough, it stops being ignored and starts being used. Not officially. Not legally. But inevitably. The Packard Mansion entered this phase without resistance. There were no guards. No consistent oversight. No clear plan for its future. The house had already lost its owners, its purpose, and its protection. What remained was space, large, empty, and unclaimed. That was enough. People began to enter. At first, it was cautious. Broken windows. Forced doors. Short visits. Then the visits became longer. Fires were lit for warmth. Furniture was dragged into central rooms and burned. Walls were stripped of anything that could be sold or reused. The mansion's interior unraveled faster than its exterior. Wooden floors weakened and collapsed. Ceilings fell in sections. Staircases that once controlled movement now ended abruptly, broken by gravity and neglect. Rainwater pooled where it had never been allowed to settle before. The house stopped deteriorating slowly. It began to fail violently. Fires became common. Some were accidental. Some deliberate. All of them destructive. Flames moved through rooms designed to impress, consuming what little remained of the mansion's original character. Decorative elements burned away first. Then structural components followed. Smoke blackened stone that had once been carefully finished. Heat warped metal fixtures beyond recognition. Each fire erased context. After enough burns, rooms lose identity. It becomes impossible to tell what they were meant for. A dining hall and a servant corridor collapse into the same category, damaged space. The mansion lost its hierarchy. Outside, Detroit was undergoing its own transformation. Entire neighborhoods hollowed out. Infrastructure decayed. Emergency services stretched thin. An abandoned mansion, no matter how large or symbolic, did not warrant priority. The Packard Mansion became part of a broader landscape of neglect. Its destruction was not shocking. It was expected. As years passed, the structure reached a point where restoration was no longer a serious option. Too much had been lost. Too many systems had failed. Repairing it would have required not just money, but justification. And there was none. The house no longer represented industrial achievement. It represented excess without function. A reminder of a scale the city could no longer support. Eventually, the conversation shifted from preservation to removal. Not because anyone wanted the mansion gone, but because keeping it standing posed a risk. Collapsing walls. Falling debris. Uncontrolled fires. The structure had become a liability. The decision to demolish was not dramatic. There were no ceremonies. No protests. No final attempts at rescue. The mansion was scheduled. When demolition began, it was efficient and impersonal. Heavy machinery reduced walls that had stood for decades. Rooms vanished in minutes. The physical effort required to erase the house was far less than the effort that had once been invested in maintaining it. Dust replaced architecture. What remained after was not emptiness, but absence. A gap where a symbol had stood. A space where memory no longer had a physical anchor. The Packard Mansion did not become a museum. It did not become housing. It did not become anything else. It was simply removed. And in a city filled with removed things, its disappearance barely registered. What had once embodied confidence, permanence, and control ended quietly, reduced to debris and then to nothing. Only the idea of it remained. A house built for an era that could not sustain itself. When the mansion was gone, nothing replaced it immediately. There was no rebirth. No transformation. No new structure rising to claim the space. There was only ground. Where stone walls once stood, there was emptiness. Where rooms had defined hierarchy and movement, there was flatness. The site did not remember the house in any visible way. It did not preserve outlines. It did not mark significance. The absence felt deliberate. Cities like Detroit do not mourn individual buildings. They absorb loss quietly, as part of a larger pattern. The Packard Mansion disappeared into that pattern without resistance. For a brief moment, people remembered. Photographs circulated. Stories were retold. Articles described what had been lost. But memory without structure is unstable. Without walls to point to, without rooms to walk through, the mansion faded from collective attention. It became a footnote. This is how industrial monuments end. Not in flames, not in collapse, but in irrelevance. Their value depends entirely on the systems that created them. When those systems fail, the structures become excessive. When they become excessive, they become optional. And when they become optional, they disappear. The Packard Mansion did not fail because it was poorly built. It failed because it was too specific. It was designed for authority, for hierarchy, for a moment when industry moved in one direction and cities followed. It assumed permanence in a country defined by change. It assumed continuity in an economy built on disruption. When that assumption broke, the house had no alternative identity. It could not shrink. It could not adapt. It could not justify itself. So it waited. And waiting, in Detroit, is another form of decline. What remains now is not the mansion, but the lesson it carried without intending to. That architecture tied too tightly to power rarely survives power's absence. That houses built to dominate do not age gracefully. That excess without purpose becomes vulnerability. The Packard Mansion is gone, but it is not unique. It belongs to a category of American homes that rose during moments of confidence and vanished when confidence dissolved. Palaces of industry. Monuments to control. Structures that believed the future was already secured. They were wrong. Detroit learned this slowly, building by building. Each demolition erased another assumption about permanence. Each empty lot reinforced the same conclusion: growth is not a guarantee, and decline does not need permission. The mansion's disappearance did not change the city, but it clarified it. Where the house once stood, there is no marker, no plaque, no warning. People pass without knowing what occupied that space before. That is the final stage of abandonment, when even memory becomes unnecessary. The Packard Mansion did not become a ghost story. It became an absence story. A reminder that some buildings are not destroyed by violence or disaster, but by time catching up to the ideas that created them. Nothing grows forever. And houses built for eternity rarely survive the moment history decides to move on.